Ask anyone whether they believe they lived before, and you'll get a variety of answers that reveal less about the question itself and more about each culture's relationship to time, to identity, and to what counts as evidence of something real. The skeptic will say there is no evidence. The believer in a specific tradition will cite the teachings of his or her tradition. The indifferent person will shrug their shoulders with the expression of someone who has more urgent matters to deal with. But if you ask a 3-year-old child, the question may not make sense in the same way, because the 3-year-old child has not yet constructed the rigid boundary between what is from this life and what could be from another, has not yet learned that identity is something that begins at birth and ends at death, and that everything else is speculation. The 3-year-old child, in many cases, documented seriously enough that they cannot simply be dismissed, says things about people he has never met, about places he has never visited, about situations he has never experienced, with a quality of certainty and detail that does not fit comfortably into any of the explanations that conventional psychology keeps available for this type of phenomenon. Rudolf Steiner investigated in depth what this phenomenon revealed about the nature of human beings in the first years of life. And what he found formed part of a much broader understanding about the relationship between the spiritual world and the physical world, about what happened when a soul incarnated, about what spiritual forces were involved in this process and what specific role they played. At the center of this understanding, there was a being that Steiner described with considerable precision in different works, a being of the angelic hierarchy, whose function at the moment of incarnation was to create, manage, and maintain the veil that separated the consciousness of the incarnated being from the memories of the incarnations that had preceded the present one. This being was neither a theological abstraction nor a metaphor for natural forgetfulness. It was, in the perspective that Steiner had developed from his direct spiritual investigation, a concrete spiritual reality with a precise function that was essential so that the development that incarnation was to produce could occur with the quality that spiritual law required. To begin to understand why this being and its function were necessary, one had to come into contact with Steiner's perspective on what he called the nature of human spiritual freedom, and why it depended on conditions that the forgetting of past lives created. The freedom Steiner had in mind was not the abstract freedom that philosophers debated, freedom as the absence of causal determination, or freedom as the ability to make choices without constraint. It was something much more concrete and much more demanding. Freedom as the ability to act from the deepest center of one's own being, from the spiritual self that was the highest dimension of the human constitution, instead of acting from the conditioning accumulated throughout experiences that had not yet been sufficiently worked on to become a genuine expression of that deeper self. This freedom was not a state that human beings simply possessed by nature. It was an achievement that needed to be progressively developed through a process that had its own laws and that required specific conditions so that it could advance in a way that served the development of both the individual being and collective humanity. And one of the most fundamental conditions for this process to happen with the genuine freedom that made it spiritually real was precisely the condition that the angelic being created, the absence of determining memory of previous incarnations that allowed the incarnated being to find the situations of the new life without the weight of a past identity that would make it impossible to genuinely transform what needed transformation. The image that captured this logic most clearly was that of the artist in front of a canvas. The artist who arrived on the canvas without any prior conditioning on what he should produce had the freedom to create something genuinely new, to respond to the moment with all the openness that the absence of determination allowed. The artist who came to the canvas with a complete memory of everything he had painted before, with all the identities and styles and commitments he had made in previous works weighing down every brushstroke, was in a position where genuine creativity was structurally more difficult, where the past determined the present in ways that limited what the present could genuinely produce. The forgetfulness of past lives created for the human being in each new incarnation, the quality of openness that allowed the artist to find the blank canvas, not because the past did not exist, not because that the qualities developed in previous incarnations were irrelevant, but because these qualities reached the present not as determining memories, but as available forces, which could be used in genuinely free ways rather than simply reproduced. The newly arrived child in the world carried these forces in an especially visible way in the first years of life, because the process of incarnation that would progressively incorporate them into the physical organism, and that would create the structures of consciousness characteristic of adult life, was still in its initial stages. Steiner described the first 7 years of life as the period in which the physical body was the main focus of the spiritual work of incarnation. The spiritual self that had inhabited the spiritual world during the period between incarnations was progressively penetrating the physical organism, establishing the connections with the etheric body and the astral body that would be the basis of all subsequent incarnated life. And during this period of progressive penetration, there was a quality of openness, of permeability to the spiritual world from which the soul had come, that made possible the expressions of past life memories that young children sometimes demonstrated. These expressions had characteristics that were recognizable to anyone who had observed them carefully. They occurred mainly between the ages of 2 and 5, when the child had developed sufficient language to express what he perceived, but the process of incarnation had not yet created the complete veil that would be characteristic of adult life. They were often marked by a quality of certainty that contrasted with children's usual uncertainty about the world they were discovering. And they tended to disappear naturally around the age of 5 or 6, not as a result of any external intervention, but as a natural consequence of the advancement of the incarnation process that made the veil progressively more solid. The angelic being responsible for creating and maintaining this veil did not operate uniformly in all human beings or at all stages of development. He operated with an intelligence that distinguished what needed to be veiled so that development could happen freely from what needed to remain accessible, even if not in an explicitly memorial way, so that development had the resources it needed. And this distinction was the aspect of this being's work that most directly connected the question of the veil of past lives with the question of the talents, difficulties, and profound orientations that each human being brought with them at birth. The talent that a child demonstrated from an early age, before any adequate instruction could have produced it, was one of the most visible expressions of how the qualities developed in previous incarnations reached the new incarnation not as memories, but as already formed forces. The child who showed extraordinary facility with music, with numbers, with spatial forms, with language, with empathy for others, was expressing the product of work that had been carried out in previous lives with an intensity and duration that had inscribed these qualities in the spiritual self in a deep enough way that they reached the new incarnation as abilities that did not need to be taught from the beginning, but that could simply be cultivated from where they already were. The difficulty that persisted despite all efforts to overcome it, which resurfaced in different forms but with the same essential structure, was the corresponding expression of patterns that had been created throughout incarnations, and that needed transformation that had not yet been sufficiently accomplished. Not as punishment or as a permanent mark of inadequacy. As the specific working material of that incarnation, identified by karmic forces as what most needed attention at that point in that being's trajectory. And the angelic being who had veiled the narratives of previous lives had left these patterns present as forces because his presence was necessary so that the work of transformation that was central to that incarnation could happen in a genuine way. There was a dimension of the consciousness of the young child that Steiner described with a specificity that is rarely found in other sources, and that was directly relevant to understanding the work of the angelic being, the dimension of what he called the cosmic consciousness of the infant. In the first months of life, before the process of progressive incarnation had created the structures of consciousness that would progressively separate the being from the surrounding world, the baby lived in a relationship with the environment that was one of total and undifferentiated immersion that had no parallel in any later phase of adult life. It wasn't a conscience in the sense that adult life gave to the term. There was no subject separated from the object. There was no I that observed an external world. There was simply experience, without the separation between what was experienced and what was experienced that would become the basic structure of adult consciousness. This cosmic consciousness, which Steiner described as analogous to the consciousness that the being had inhabited in the spiritual world between incarnations, but now expressed in the physical body newly arrived in the world, was at the same time the expression of the proximity that the being still had with the world from which it had come, and the reason why the structures of adult consciousness needed to be progressively developed throughout the first years of life. The baby's cosmic consciousness was spiritually richer in certain ways, but it was not the consciousness that human development in the present age required. Development required separate individual consciousness of the self as an entity distinct from the world it perceived, and the process of progressive incarnation of the first 7 years was precisely the process by which this individual consciousness was built up from the initial cosmic consciousness. During this construction process, there was a specific temporal window, which Steiner placed mainly between the ages of 2 and 5, in which consciousness had advanced sufficiently from the cosmic pole for the child to have sufficient language and intentionality to express what he perceived, but had not yet advanced sufficiently to the individual pole for the veil that the angelic being had initiated at birth to be completely solid. It was in this window that the expressions of memories from past lives were more frequent and more detailed, because it was in this window that the permeability to the spiritual world was still sufficient for elements from previous incarnations to surface to the surface of the forming consciousness. The way children experienced and expressed these memories had qualities that were distinct from the way an adult would recall events from this incarnation. There was not the reflective distance that adult memory usually creates between what was remembered and what was currently experienced. The child who expressed a memory from a past life often did so with the immediacy of someone who was describing something they experienced as present, as if the border between what had been and what was did not yet have the solidity that adult consciousness maintained between the past and the present. And this quality of immediacy was, in Steiner's view, precisely evidence that what was being expressed was not a secondary elaboration of previously stored material, but the direct outcropping of something that was still present as an active force in the child's spiritual field. The response that the surrounding adults gave to these expressions had consequences that Steiner saw as important for the child's subsequent development, and especially for the relationship the child would develop with his or her own inner life over the years that followed. The response that simply dismissed what the child expressed with the skepticism that the materialist paradigm prescribed was creating, however inadvertently, the message that what came from the deeper dimensions of inner experience was not worthy of being taken seriously, and this message had its impact on the relationship the child would learn to have with his or her own depth. The response that attempted to extract more information, that transformed the child's spontaneous expression into a project of investigation into specific past lives, was disturbing the process that the angelic being had carefully prepared, creating an awareness of what needed to be naturally allowed to recede. The response that honored what was expressed without amplifying or suppressing it, that received what the child said with the quality of attention that recognized reality without creating dependence or anxiety around that reality, was the response that served the developmental process in the way that process required. It was the response that allowed the child to know that what came from within was real and deserved attention, at the same time that it did not create a structure of adult interest around this reality that could distort natural development. And it was this quality of response that the pedagogy that Steiner had developed sought to cultivate in educators who worked with young children, not as a specific technique, but as a quality of presence that was only possible when the adult had developed sufficient familiarity with his or her own inner life not to be threatened or overly fascinated by what the child's inner life expressed. The role of the angelic being in creating the veil over past lives also had a dimension that was especially important for understanding what Steiner called it, the evolution of consciousness, the dimension of progressiveness. The veil that the angelic being created was not created once and then simply kept static throughout the entire incarnated life. It was a dynamic process that responded to the development of the being at each stage, that became progressively more solid as the process of incarnation progressed through the first 7 years, that reached relative stability throughout ordinary adult life, and that could be progressively made more permeable again through the conscious spiritual development that Steiner described in works such as How to Acquire Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. This progressiveness was a fundamental aspect of the logic of the angelic being. It was not simply blocking access to past lives in a permanent and irremediable way. It was creating the conditions so that access that occurred without adequate preparation was progressively replaced by access that came with development that made it genuinely useful for development rather than potentially disruptive. The human being who had undertaken the path of spiritual development with the seriousness that this path required developed over time and with the work that was necessary, the faculties that made a conscious encounter with the guardian of the threshold possible, and in that encounter what had been veiled began to become accessible in ways that served development rather than complicating it. This development was not the objective of the text. But it was important to mention it so that the perspective was complete. The angelic being who created the veil was at the same time creating the conditions so that the veil could be made progressively more permeable through appropriate work. And this made forgetting not the last word on the human being's relationship with their past lives, but the starting point of a relationship that could progressively deepen as spiritual development advanced. You don't remember, but you've been here before. And the reason you don't remember is not that what happened before this life doesn't matter, nor that the being who guards the boundary between past and present is indifferent to what you need to know. The reason is that what you need for this life is not the memory of where you have been. It's the freedom to choose what you're going to do with the forces you brought from there. Memories would have determined. The forces are available. The angelic being knows the difference with a clarity that incarnated consciousness rarely achieves. And the love with which you do your work is the same love that made it possible for you to arrive here with everything you have built throughout your entire career, even without the ability to name it, so that you could use it in a way that no previous incarnation had yet been able to use with the freedom that this specific incarnation, with this specific forgetting, with this specific new beginning, has finally made possible. There was a connection between the work of the angelic being and the question of what Steiner called the specific purpose of each incarnation that was essential to understanding why the veil was not arbitrary but precisely calculated. Before each incarnation, in the period that Steiner described as the state between death and new birth, The being went through a process of review and planning that involved not only the being itself, but the spiritual hierarchies that guided human development, and especially the angelic being that had accompanied that soul throughout all its incarnations. In this process, what needed to be developed in the next incarnation was identified with a clarity that incarnated consciousness rarely achieved. And the conditions that made this development possible were chosen with a precision that included not only the parents and cultural environment, but also the karmic encounters that needed to happen, and the patterns that needed to be found and transformed. The angelic being who would later create the veil at the moment of incarnation had participated in this planning process, and therefore knew, with a clarity that the incarnated being would not have access to, what needed to be veiled so that development could happen with genuine freedom, and what needed to be left sufficiently present so that the being would have access to the resources that the development of incarnation required. This intelligence about what to guard and what to preserve was an aspect of the work of the angelic being that was rarely discussed in the depth it deserved, because it made evident something that the materialist perspective made incomprehensible, that the forgetting of past lives was not simply a biological consequence of incarnation in a new body, but an intentional spiritual act precisely calibrated to serve the development of a specific being in a specific incarnation. The child who arrived with a particular set of talents that emerged without adequate instruction was arriving with resources that prenatal planning had identified as necessary so that the purposes of that incarnation could be realized. And the angelic being had veiled the narrative of the lives in which these talents had been developed, not because these narratives were irrelevant, but because their presence as explicit memories would have disturbed the freedom with which the talents needed to be used in the new incarnation. The pianist who knew when sitting at the piano for the first time in this life that he had played in previous lives would be in a relationship with this talent that would be fundamentally different from the relationship of someone who simply perceived in himself an extraordinary facility whose origin he could not identify, but whose reality was undeniable. In the first case, talent would be experienced as an inheritance of a past identity. In the second, as an expression of something that was simply and completely his, that could be developed with the freedom of whoever possessed it, without the shadow of a debt to a past that needed to be honored or repeated. The question of reincarnation that Steiner developed in his work was, therefore, not the trivial question of whether souls return to live in new bodies, although this was the most frequently invoked form of the theme. It was the much deeper question of how a being's spiritual trajectory over multiple incarnations related to the development of genuine freedom that was the highest goal of human development in the current phase of cosmic evolution. And the answer that Steiner gave to this question completely transformed the meaning of forgetting. Instead of being the loss of what had been accumulated, it was the condition of possibility so that what had been accumulated could be genuinely used, instead of simply reproduced. There was a specific dimension of the phenomenon of past life memories in children that Steiner observed that had implications for understanding broader spiritual development, the emotional quality of these memories. Children who expressed memories of past lives often demonstrated, along with factual memories of places and people, emotional reactions that had an intensity and specificity that did not correspond to this life experience. A child who expressed distress over a specific form of death that he described as having experienced in a previous life was carrying not only the factual information, but the emotional quality of that experience as a living force that still operated in his astral field. And this emotional quality had implications for present development. It was often the expression of an astral pattern that karma had identified as needing transformation in the present incarnation, and which arrived in the new incarnation in the form of a sensitivity or a fear or an aversion that had a deeper root than the history of this life could explain. The pedagogy that Steiner had developed for the first years of life took this emotional dimension into account in a way that was rarely recognized as related to the issue of past lives, but had its precise spiritual logic. The safe and warm environment that Waldorf pedagogy created for young children was not just psychologically beneficial in the sense that conventional developmental psychology described it. It was spiritually necessary so that the process of progressive incarnation could happen in a healthy way, so that astral patterns arriving from previous lives could be encountered and worked with in ways that served development rather than crystallizing into configurations that would make subsequent development more difficult than it needed to be. The child who arrived with a pattern of intense fear linked to a form of loss or abandonment experienced in a previous incarnation needed an environment that provided a sufficiently consistent experience of presence and care that could create, over time, a counter-experience capable of progressively dissolving the pattern without anyone around needing to know the origin of what was being worked on. The teacher in the first years of schooling that Waldorf pedagogy described, who accompanied the same students over several years instead of changing each year as was customary in other pedagogies, was creating precisely the continuity of relationship that made possible a deep knowledge of each child that monitoring for a single year rarely allowed. And this deep knowledge included, for the teacher who had developed the appropriate sensitivity, the perception of what forces the children brought with them that could not be explained by what had happened in the years of this incarnation, and how these forces could be more effectively cultivated or transformed depending on their specific nature. The karmic perspective on child development also had implications for the issue of so-called difficult children, children whose behaviors and needs defied the expectations of the adults around them, and who were often placed in diagnostic categories that described symptoms without addressing causes. Steiner saw many of the difficulties that children demonstrated not as deficits to be corrected, but as expressions of karmic forces that arrived with particular intensity and that required not the suppression or normalization that conventional educational systems often attempted, but the understanding of the specific nature of these forces and the creation of conditions that allowed their development in ways that were genuinely constructive. This perspective required from the educator a level of spiritual understanding that went far beyond what conventional training provided. And that was why the training of Waldorf teachers included a dimension of inner development that conventional pedagogical training simply did not consider relevant. The teacher who had developed sufficient familiarity with his own inner life, with his own karmic origins as far as he could perceive them, with the forces that he had brought from where he had been before he was here, that teacher had the possibility of perceiving in the children around him something that the teacher who had ignored that dimension could not perceive. The presence of real spiritual forces that needed to be met with a quality of attention that honored them for who they were, rather than simply trying to mold them into the form that the system expected. The angelic being who held the veil over the past lives of each child who came into the classroom was present in that space in a way that the spiritually sensitive teacher could learn to perceive, not as a presence that needed to be specifically identified, but as a quality in each child's development, a direction that development took that was something deeper than simply the result of the influences of this incarnation. And realizing that direction, working with it rather than against it, creating the environment that made it possible for her to express herself with the fullness that that child's spiritual destiny had identified as possible and necessary, was the deepest and most demanding work any educator could do. What made this work especially difficult in contemporary times, which was also what made it especially necessary, was the depth to which the dominant culture had normalized the view that the human being began at birth, and that everything in him was the exclusive product of the genetics and environment of this life. This normalization made invisible precisely what the spiritual perspective made most relevant: that each child arrived with a story, with strengths, with purposes that preceded the present birth, and that needed to be honored with a quality of attention that the purely materialistic perspective simply did not provide the tools to offer. You don't remember, but you were once here, and the forces you brought with you from where you were are active in this life in ways that are much more concrete and much more determining than any explicit memory would be. They are in the talent that appeared before any adequate instruction, in the difficulty that returns in different forms, but with the same essential structure. In the encounter, he arrived with the quality of need that transcended what this incarnation had created. In the love he recognized before he had enough reason to recognize it, in the sense of mission that persists when all the justifications of this life would be insufficient to sustain it. These are the marks of what the angelic being preserved while watching over the rest, the forces that passed through the threshold, because they were necessary so that the work of this incarnation could be carried out with the depth and freedom that the being who carried them through all the crossings had identified, with the precise love of an intelligence that saw the entire trajectory at once, as the forces that were most important to take to the next beginning. To complete the perspective that Steiner offered on the work of the angelic being and its relationship with infantile consciousness, it was necessary to address an aspect that often remained in the shadow of discussions about past lives: the relationship between individual forgetfulness and the collective development of humanity. Steiner saw the evolution of consciousness not as a process that occurred only at the level of each individual being following his or her particular trajectory, but as a process that had equally real collective dimensions, in which the development of each being contributed to the development of humanity as a whole in ways that a purely individual perspective could not capture. From this perspective, forgetting the past, lives that the angelic being created did not only serve the individual development of the being that he incarnated, it also served the collective development of humanity by ensuring that each incarnation introduced into the fabric of collective existence something that was genuinely new, that emerged from the freedom of a real encounter with the conditions of the present, rather than simply reproducing what had been done before. Humanity was, in this reading, the cumulative result of countless encounters between beings who arrived at the present with forces developed over long trajectories, and who used these forces with the freedom that oblivion had preserved to create, incarnation after incarnation, that which no purely conscious planning could have anticipated, and no pure continuity of memory could have generated, the genuinely unprecedented, which was the only thing that the spiritual development of the cosmos needed each incarnation to contribute. The humanity that developed through beings who completely remembered all previous incarnations would be a humanity that tended toward repetition, that advanced only to the extent that the patterns of the past were consciously perceived and consciously transformed, which was a process much slower and much more difficult than the process that oblivion made possible, the process in which each being arrived at the present with the freedom to genuinely create something new from the forces it had. Developed without the determining weight of a past identity that would make this creativity structurally genuine. More difficult. The child who arrived into the world and who demonstrated in his early years a permeability to elements of his past lives was therefore, in the broadest perspective, participating in a process that had significance not only for his own development, but for the collective development of human consciousness. And the angelic being who gradually closed the veil on these memories as the incarnation process progressed was creating the conditions so that the specific contribution that incarnation had been chosen to make to collective development could be genuinely realized, with the freedom and creativity that made spiritual contributions genuine rather than just reproductions of contributions that had already been made. The relationship between childhood consciousness and past lives therefore revealed, ultimately, something about the nature of spiritual development that transcended the specific question of memories of previous incarnations. It revealed that genuine spiritual development was always at the same time individual and collective, always at the same time rooted in a past that had created it and oriented towards a future that still needed to be built, always at the same time expression of forces that came from where the being had been and creation of forces that would go where the being was going. The angelic being who guarded the veil was guarding not only the memory of the individual past, but the possibility of the collective future, knowing that these two purposes were, at bottom, the same purpose seen from different angles, the purpose of a cosmos that developed through beings who were simultaneously the product of its entire history and the creator of everything that had not yet been created. There is something you know that you don't know that you know. It is present in the quality with which you recognize certain truths at the moment you encounter them, not as learning but as remembrance, in the ease with which certain domains of experience open up to you in ways that surprise, how deeply certain relationships affect you in ways that the story of this life doesn't fully explain. In the feeling, sometimes fleeting, sometimes persistent, that there is a thread that runs through this life and that extends beyond it in both directions, that it came from where you came and that it goes where you are going, and that the being who kept the memories of what is in that thread did not keep them forever, but for now, for this moment when you are incarnated enough to use what you have brought and free enough to do with it, something that no previous incarnation has yet been able to do. There was also a perspective that completed the picture. The question of what happened to the adult who, through spiritual development or simply through an acuity of attention that was rarely cultivated in a deliberate way, began to perceive the signs of past lives that the angelic being had left visible while veiling the explicit narrative. Not all adults who were interested in the question of past lives arrived at it through the same path. Some arrived for experiences that they were unable to frame it another way. The immediate recognition of someone I had never met in this life, the fear of situations that had never represented a real threat in this incarnation, the irresistible attraction to historical periods or cultures that I had never inhabited in this life, the facility with languages or arts that simply did not correspond to what the learning in this incarnation could have produced. Others arrived through the path of deliberate spiritual development, through the practices that Steiner had described or other traditions that worked on the development of spiritual perception in different but equally serious ways. In both cases, what was beginning to become accessible were not narratives of previous lives with the photographic clarity that common sense about memories might suggest. It was something subtler and more structurally significant, a growing understanding of the logic of development itself, of the deeper reason why certain situations and certain relationships had come into life with the specific configuration they had, of how the thread that ran through incarnations expressed itself in the qualities and difficulties and encounters of this life in ways that became progressively more readable to those who had developed the right eyes to read them. It was less like remembering specific events and more like beginning to perceive the structure that had produced the events, the spiritual logic that had determined the conditions and that made it understandable in a way that the perspective purely of this incarnation could not, why this life had taken the form it had. For many adults who came to this realization, it had an effect that was both liberating and demanding. Liberating because it dissolved the sense of arbitrariness that accompanied the most difficult aspects of life, the sense that difficulties were simply bad luck or senseless injustice, and revealed in them a logic of development that gave them a meaning that the perspective purely of this incarnation could not provide. Demanding because it made it more difficult to avoid spiritual. Responsibility for what had arrived in life as a pattern to be worked on, it made it more difficult to simply attribute to destiny or to others what the karmic perspective revealed as an expression of forces that the being itself had created throughout its trajectory, and that the being itself, with the freedom that oblivion had preserved, had the capacity and responsibility to transform. The angelic being who had created the veil over past lives had created with it, paradoxically, the conditions for a form of spiritual responsibility deeper than any form that complete memory would have made possible. The being, who knew where his patterns came from, could always attribute them to the past that had created these conditions, and over which he no longer had control. The being who encountered his patterns without knowing where they came from, who encountered them simply as the present working material of the present life, had a freedom to transform them that was not compromised by any identification with a past that needed to be honored or preserved. And this freedom to transform what arrived without the shadow of its known origin was, for Steiner, the most profound gift that forgetting provided. Not the lightness of not knowing, but the freedom to act on what was, regardless of how it had come to be what it was. The child who had expressed past life memories in the early years, and who had naturally let these memories recede as the incarnation process progressed, had not lost what he had briefly accessed. He had simply received what the angelic being had prepared for him to receive. Strengths without memories, resources without the weight of past identities, capabilities without the limitations of a history that needed to be repeated. And these forces, these resources, these capabilities were what made each incarnated life a genuine starting point rather than just a continuation, a real beginning, rather than just another chapter in a story that remained the same. The angelic being who guarded the veil was guarding the possibility of the new. And the new, each time an incarnated being used with genuine freedom what he had brought from where he had been, was precisely the most valuable contribution that any life could make to the ongoing development of a cosmos that needed the genuinely new to move forward. You don't remember, but I brought it. And what it brought is here, present in this life as an available force, just waiting for the consciousness that this incarnation was built to develop, to reach the depth in which it can finally recognize it, not as a memory, but as itself, which is always much more than any memory could offer to any being that has come this far. I with the courage to start again.